Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University.
Welcome back, everyone. We have Dr. Paul Carrse back with us today to talk about Baron de Montesquieu. Dr. Carrse, our question today is, how did Montesquieu's idea about separation of powers influence our Constitution?
Thank you, Liz. This is a really important topic. In a general way, it fits with topics and questions we posed in earlier episodes about philosophy and philosophers, or very big ideas shaping the Declaration of Independence and the argument for revolution and independence, shape now to be thinking about our constitutional order as a whole from the founding period, being shaped by leading philosophers. This is an Enlightenment philosopher, as the term is used, a modern philosopher of liberal democratic politics. Montesquieu is a Frenchman. He is a lawyer who becomes a judge, but he becomes more fascinated as a young man with philosophy than with being a lawyer and a judge. And as a nobleman, he has enough money to devote himself to philosophy. And he becomes quite famous as a fairly young man. And that gives him, for a book he writes, a kind of novel, a satire about French politics and European life. And that gives him a little more time to write a huge work that he spends 20 years writing called The Spirit of Laws, or The Spirit of the Laws. And this book by Montesquieu was the textbook, in effect, of political science for what becomes the American founders' generation. It's published in 1748 in France. It's very quickly translated into English. One reason it's translated into English is he has two long chapters in this very big book that praise the English Constitution and English politics because of its devotion to liberty. And the English like this. They like a French nobleman who's a baron and a judge. They like this. And so it gets translated very quickly by 1750, and then it's in the American colonies very quickly. And so by the time that, think of people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison going to college in the American colonies. Well, this is like the new hot standard kind of textbook of what the science of politics is, of what political philosophy is. For very clearly, Montesquieu's being very, it's a huge book. He's being very comprehensive. It's almost encyclopedic about monarchies and republics, and he's very against despotism and authoritarian politics. But he's for the American colonists, this is great because he's talking about politics of liberty and the rule of law supporting liberty and constitutionalism. So he becomes, as the American Revolution is breaking out, we think, well, John Locke is the most important philosopher. And there's a way in which Locke is more important than Montesquieu on the arguments about revolution. But Montesquieu's always there in the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s. I think the scholars are correct who argue he's the single most important philosopher of the entire founding period. And so here's the separation of powers question. If you think about the Declaration of Independence, you read the whole thing, the separation of powers is there. What does the separation of powers mean? That a politics of liberty needs law to structure politics, set the rules and guardrails, so that these ideas of individual rights that we have, these ideas of equality among all people that we have, are actually being practiced and enforced and observed by everybody. And Montesquieu's argument is you need to disperse the powers. You need a kind of division of labor if this politics of the rule of law and ordered liberty constitutional government is actually going to work. So the three powers, and we get this formula from Montesquieu, not from any other philosopher. The three powers are: you want a legislative power, a body of representatives who make the laws. But how do they do that? They argue with each other. They deliberate with each other to make the laws. And then we'll talk more about how complicated Montesquieu thinks that should be. Then an executive power, a governor, a president, ministers, things like that, people who will take the laws and execute them, implement them, administer them, make sure they're actually being followed by everybody, including everybody in the government, as well as the citizens and foreigners and others. So we've got two powers now: legislative power, making the laws; executive power. And then he is definitely the innovator. Montesquieu is the innovator of this third one, because John Locke talks about an executive power and a legislative power. Legislative power is first for Locke, of course, then an executive power. But he doesn't really talk about judges or judiciary very much. Locke doesn't. Montesquieu makes a big deal out of the judicial power of courts. It's not, he doesn't invent the idea. I mean, Aristotle's talking about courts and judges and juries and things like that. Montesquieu just says, if you want a politics of liberty and an ordered liberty under the rule of law and constitutionalism, you must have an independent judiciary. Now, it's the third power. It's the least powerful power. It's the least political power, but it's got to be there. And so that's the separation of powers theory, philosophy that Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, Madison, John Jay, they're all reading this in college in a way. And it's there from 1775, right? Before, we forget this, before the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776, the Second Continental Congress is saying to the colonies, you are in effect states already. You should be drafting constitutions. You're not colonies anymore. Because, especially after Lexington and Concord, shots have been fired. So get serious, folks. And there are states that draft constitutions by late 1775 and early 1776. And what do? Separation of powers. This state shall have a government of this kind, and it shall have a legislative branch, it shall have an executive branch, it shall have a judicial branch. It's Montesquieu, right? So I'm not saying Locke is not important at the time of the day, right? Locke's very important, but he's not the only important philosopher. And the Declaration itself says the king and the parliament have violated this principle about the legislative power, and this principle about the executive power, and this principle about the judicial power, and the way the powers are supposed to interact and be separated from each other. So, and in fact, God is referred to, the divinity is referred to as a legislator, an executive, and a judge. If you think about the references to a divinity in the Declaration of Independence. So this is a big idea, this separation of powers idea. We kind of take it for granted, and we kind of demean it. Oh, these are the stupid questions you get on a quiz about how many branches of government are, and who cares? It's just mechanics, and it's just wrong. This is foundational for, to use Montesquieu's phrase for his book, the spirit of the laws, the whole spirit and philosophy of our form of politics and law.
So why did Montesquieu then think that kind of this complicated structure of institutions would be helpful for free politics rather than a hindrance? Because it would almost seem to somebody who's maybe not familiar of, why are you giving all of these different branches, all of these different, jobs? Why can't Congress or the legislator make laws and then make sure people are following them?
Yes, this kind of concern about the inefficiency or how complicated this is, hard to understand, hard to operate, hard to get things done, right? This criticism really arose in the late 19th century and the 20th century among American thinkers. Woodrow Wilson is probably the most famous as a professor of political science before he becomes president, saying that this is a kind of Newtonian mechanics, action and reaction, and it's too complicated a machinery. We need something more organic, and he, of course, becomes president, but he, as a political science professor, he's saying a single president collaborating with a legislature the way the British do it, right? A prime minister who's actually a member of the parliament, of the legislative body, that's much more organic and efficient. It gets things done quickly. So Montesquieu knows about those arguments and is insisting that the principle of liberty is important. And he's very worried about concentrating too much power in any one branch. And there's a negative, so to speak, part of that, preventing something bad from happening, despotism, authoritarianism, actually majoritarianism. You have a very popular figure. He or she wins an election, and then they just want to change everything, right? And minority views then get trampled upon, and minority rights get trampled on. So Montesquieu is very concerned to argue the advantages of making a more complicated form of government. And the negative side is prevent too much power being concentrated in any one branch, especially in a king, a monarchy, or a president, or a popular figure, right? So that's the kind of negative preventative side. The positive side is this idea I mentioned earlier, a division of labor. We do this all the time in life, right? Wouldn't you be a better judge if you focused on judging? It's complicated enough as it is. Knowing all the law, knowing all the case law, knowing how lawyers argue and think, and you're not trying to do 5 jobs, okay? And this is true all over our lives. Wouldn't legislators do a better job if they focused on the very complicated and important task of representing a population of citizens from different places and different points of view and arguing with each other? Listening to each other, arguing with each other. And here, Montesquieu, it's sort of the principle, you could make fun of it, the more complicated, the better. He likes what the English came up with across hundreds of years of constitutional development. This legislative branch, the English say, we're going to split it in 2. We're going to have an upper house and it's a constitutional monarchy. So there's an aristocracy, a class of nobles. We're going to have an upper house for the nobles, the House of Lords, and we're going to have a lower house with more members in it for the commons, the commoners, the common people. Mm-hmm. And Montesquieu says this is a very good idea. And of course, the Americans then take this over and saying, yes, we want an upper house, which becomes the Senate. In the state constitutions, they have different names. An upper house, smaller, different functions, and then a larger, more representative, you could say more democratic branch in the legislature. So the more complicated the legislature is, the better, because now you're doing better work in representing different points of view, and there's got to be more argument and then more compromise. And so there in the legislative power, Montesquieu's idea is he likes the English and wants to sort of, you have to do it in your own way, wherever you are in the world, right? But here's the English model. You will get out of that complicated legislative process, bicameralism, we call it, 2 houses. You will get more argument, more space for minorities to make their arguments or minority points of view, and more compromise. And then you can think on the negative side, the laws will be less dumb, less stupid, less unjust. Or you could think on the positive side, these laws will be smarter, a little bit wiser, a little bit more just, and have a larger consensus majority behind them. Okay, so legislative power will be better if that's separate from the others. Executive power will be, is action, the principle of action. If an executive can focus on action, not on having to sit around and deliberate and listen to people and argue, that'll be done better. And then the judging power is kind of the safety valve for these 2. And he's really the innovator in this. You want a safety valve beyond the lawmakers and the people who execute and enforce the laws for the average citizen or association or corporation to say, wait a minute, I'm not guilty of violating the law. A prosecutor from the executive branch has come after me, right? Or a fellow citizen or another corporation or some entity is violating the law and the executive is not doing anything about it, and I need to file a lawsuit. Right. So this leads to the great American principle. I mean, it's got to be written somewhere in our founding documents, the right to sue. This is the great American thing, right? That we have lawyers and we can sue other people, right? So this is Montesquieu's idea. If you divide, you'll get better functioning in each of the 3 crucial functions: legislating, executive, and enforcing. And especially there, by the way, I should mention international affairs, right? Because the king or a president or a prime minister is the chief executive about foreign affairs and defense and security and war. You need speed there, not deliberation. You need to get stuff done quickly. And then the judicial power to be this kind of safety valve. And then to sort of to wrap it all up, that's all the positive division of labor kind of argument. I mentioned the negative, don't concentrate power. Montesquieu is also saying that this will be a better form of politics for everybody if the powers are not entirely separate from each other, a little bit mixed with each other, because this is a paradox. This is how you keep them separate. They can kind of protect each other. They can protect themselves from the others by being a little bit mixed with the other one, right? So the president has a veto power in our constitutional system. A governor or a president has a veto power against the legislature. He can't strike down every law. The veto can be overridden. But kind of, if the executive thinks, hey, wait a minute, you folks in the legislature are way out of your lane. You're way out of your bounds. It's a kind of protection, defensive mechanism. And the legislature, well, can prevent the executive from doing things by not funding the executive, or by overriding vetoes, or by turning down appointments that the executive suggests. The judiciary has this power, which it's not literally written in our 1787 Constitution, but was implied at the Constitutional Convention. We call it judicial review, a power of constitutional review, right? If they think the legislature and the president have gone out of their bounds, gone out of their lane, and written a statute or some other action that violates the Constitution, the judges can say, hey, wait a minute, that's null and void, right? So this kind of a little mixing of the powers, just enough to keep them separate and make sure the other players in the game follow the rules. So you could say the separation of powers is generally the positive principle, the positive division of labor. Each of these functions will be done better if separated. And then checks and balances, which is a different principle but clearly related, is the kind of negative principle, the checking principle, to help with the separation and to generally help with this issue of not letting any one branch or center of power have too much power. So that's the larger argument. And again, Montesquieu spells this out in The Spirit of Laws, uses the English Constitution as a case study, but he's making his own philosophical arguments about it along the way. And it ends up being the concise statement of the English political constitutional culture. There's no one in the English language who states it so concisely and philosophically. Blackstone, after Montesquieu, writes Commentaries on the Laws of England and cites Montesquieu as the first philosopher, modern philosopher he cites, right? So it's a funny thing. We know this in life, right? You travel abroad and you learn some things about another country, but you also see some things about your own country by and Montesquieu lived in England for about 18 months. And then wrote this study later, and it ends up being this wonderful, concise statement, and it just goes like wildfire in the American colonies. They think that's what a constitutional government of liberty is. And so my hunch is this word right in the middle of the Declaration of Independence. We don't pay a lot of attention to it. A charge where the Second Continental Congress, it's in Jefferson's draft, almost in this way. He, the king, has joined with others to violate our Constitution in the singular. Jefferson had our constitutions, plural. And Congress says, Second Continental Congress says, no, this violates our Constitution. It violates the Constitution of Liberty. What does that mean? That's Montesquieu's Constitution of Liberty. His explanation, this is what the English political culture and Constitution of Liberty is. The king and parliament are violating it. So that's Montesquieu's influence right there in 1776. And so, look, if you don't like this form of government, it's too complicated, and you want to make your arguments against it, the challenge for you is you better read Montesquieu, and you better read Blackstone, and you better read the Federalist Papers, and you better know the very big, long thinking and arguments defending this kind of constitutionalism, which is in our federal constitution and in almost all the state constitutions have the tripartite separation of powers. So you better know about all this, and then have your criticisms and complaints.
And I appreciate that you brought up the Federalist Papers, because that'll be in later episodes. So as you're talking about, separation of powers, I'm thinking about Federalist 51 and thinking about Federalist 70 and Federalist 78 when we talk about the executive and the judiciary. And I know we have some really great episodes coming up on that. So Montesquieu really didn't just have a little bit of influence. There was a lot of influence, and we see that. Dr. Carrse, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.